This time, we're on the windswept plains of Wiltshire, where a dramatic and derelict monument dominates the surrounding landscape. It's called Old Sarum, and it was once one of the most important cities in Britain. This is a place where Saxon royals minted money for a kingdom, where William the Conqueror flaunted his victory over King Harold, and where the Domesday book was created. But now there are just echoes of Old Sarum's former glory, an abandoned ruin that overlooks the bustling city that replaced it 2 miles to the south, Salisbury. The Salisbury we know and love is effectively a new town. It's a wet behind the ears whippersnapper in comparison to some of our more ancient settlements. Established in around 1220, this place was often referred to as New Salisbury or New Sarum, which of course rather begs the question, what happened to Old Sarum? Well, the answer lies somewhere in these spectacular remains. Remnants of a medieval castle sit on top of a huge mound, which is surrounded by vast ditches and a cross-shaped ruin. All of which suggests that Sarum was once a place of great power and importance. I have to say, I do love this about Britain because there have been all these different kinds of people living here over 400,000 years. You do find these amazing, mysterious sites just kind of cropping up off a main road.
Oh, isn't it great? I mean, thousands of years of history. Just in a glance here, you can see Iron Age ramparts there. We're going back 2,500 years. We've got this great Norman earthwork in front of us. Just wonderful, layer upon layer of activity and history.
But so what are you hoping to get from sending the camera up into the air?
Well, I think this place, impressive though it is from the ground, will yield even more from the air. I think there's much more to this place than meets the eye.
From the ground, the overwhelming sense you get is of an enormous, grass-covered mound. But all that changes when you take to the sky. To really get to grips with the mystery of Old Sarum, Ben will use his octocopter to give him a bird's-eye view of this intriguing earthwork. This tiny flying camera can give us a completely new perspective on this site, a way to restore the centuries of history etched around this hill.
Oh, it's looking gorgeous. Oh, there we go. We're getting some height now, and immediately you can start seeing the scale of the place.
It's as if the landscape itself has a memory recorded in its lumps and bumps. And from the air, Ben can decode this to piece together a picture of its past life. And the first thing that's obvious is that the castle is not the beginning of the story for Sarum.
Well, we've got to ignore that big mound in the centre. That's medieval, and just concentrate for a moment on this great ditch encircling the entire hill. Now that's Iron Age, and these are the classic defences of an Iron Age hill fort built well before the Romans arrived. And there are hill forts, and there are hill forts, and this is a massive one. Huge banks, huge ditches. This one was built about 2,500 years ago. And they're partly about display, they're partly about saying, look how important we are, look what we can achieve, but they're also partly about defence and refuge. So when you're being threatened by the neighbouring tribe, this is somewhere to come.
These impressive ditches were carved into this chalk hill with basic hand tools and a lot of muscle. But in spite of their primitive construction, they were a formidable defence.
Oh, look at that. In their prime, these defences would have been not grassy banks, but exposed chalk rubble. And that's incredibly difficult to clamber up, especially when wet. And even if you managed to get over that first bit of the defences, you'd be in the bottom of a massive ditch looking up at this great defensive wall and having missiles, all sorts of projectiles thrown at you. It's a great big piece of prehistoric civil engineering.
This was, in effect, an Iron Age town, where a community or tribe lived in roundhouses, occasionally seeking refuge behind the great defensive ditches during times of intertribal conflict. And it seems Sarum's strategic importance didn't run out with the end of the Iron Age, because Ben can see from the air clear evidence that the site almost immediately became the focal point of a new Roman road network. Oh, well, that is great. Look, there's no mistaking that Roman road, is there?
Absolute classic.
They're so audacious, aren't they? It's kind of bang, this is the direction we want to go in, so we're going there. No compromise.
That's not the only Roman road that comes through this area. There's a convergence of Roman roads here. So that one goes off to Winchester, and the one that goes between the modern houses and the airfield buildings there, that's up to Silchester, through Hampshire and on to London. It's a real meeting place of Roman roads.
All roads lead to Old Sarum. So why is Salisbury now 2 miles away? It is odd, because a number of Britain's towns and cities began just like Old Sarum. They grew up from ancient settlements linked to the rest of the country by Roman roads. And Sarum continued to grow after the Romans left. This was a time of violent unrest and Viking raids. It was here that the Saxons hurriedly moved their mint for extra security. This time our evidence doesn't come from massive earthworks, but from tiny coins in the storerooms at Salisbury Museum.
So this one here is of Ethelred II, or Ethelred the Unready, and we can see on this side here that it was made by a man called Godwin, and then he's abbreviated the name of Old Sarum to S-E-R-E. So you can't get better evidence than that, really. And then on the flip side here, we actually have the face of the king, and the coin's been double stamped, so it's very difficult to see.
So what other kings had their coins minted?
Well, this one I've pulled out here is of Canute, again, very famous king, English king, or actually Danish king, who ruled England, I should say.
Yeah.
And that's not the only king, because again, we also have Edward the Confessor, who of course reigned right up till 1066 when William the Conqueror invaded. You can see then the profile of Edward the Confessor there, holding his staff and with his crown.
I mean, Edward the Confessor is the one that goes on then to found Westminster Abbey. So none of these kings are bit part players, are they?
No, absolutely not. These are major 11th century kings of this country.
But the next Saxon king with links to Sarum was to be the last. King Harold came from the Kingdom of Wessex, and Sarum was part of his home turf. But the year was 1066, and Harold and Sarum were about to suffer the consequences of the Norman invasion. Harold reputedly met his death on the wrong end of an arrow at the Battle of Hastings, and the Saxon city of Sarum became a coveted prize for the victorious Norman king. When William the Conqueror invaded in 1066, Sarum was already dominating the surrounding landscape. As the leader of an occupying force and a man who loved building castles, these ancient earthworks were the perfect spot. William ordered his men to get busy. And they did, stamping their presence here by building a castle at the heart of this defeated Saxon city. On the ground, great stone walls of that new Norman castle still litter the centre of Sarum. But it's only when you look from the sky you can see just how thorough William's takeover was.
This became a very formidable Norman castle. This is all built in stone, and it gives the site a real feeling of permanence. And you've got all sorts of buildings in there for the garrison. You've got that well in the centre. So they're really in charge of a good water supply. And look how thick those walls are. And there, that building, that looks like the classic Norman keep or great tower. And it's really like a scaled down version of the Tower of London, I suppose. Now, this castle wouldn't have just dominated the site of Old Sarum itself, but the surrounding countryside as well.
I think it's making a real statement about the arrival of the Normans as a new monarchy here in England. Is not just a sort of military necessity, but it really is a statement of a new dynasty has arrived. We are the Norman monarchy and we are in charge now.
But he could have chosen anywhere to build this huge castle. Why here?
I think that this was Harold's land, this was Harold's town, city, monument, and really if you're going to conquer Harold, then you're going to conquer his backyard, and they've built this really on top of the memory really of Harold Godwinson and the rest of the Anglo-Saxon history.
England now belonged to William the Conqueror and his Normans. And it was here, we're told, the most powerful in the land came to declare their allegiance to William. Sarum was an embodiment of the Normans' complete and utter supremacy over the old Saxon world. This great castle left a new shadow in the landscape. Painted a stark white, it would have dominated the countryside for 20 miles all around, an incarnation of William's newfound power. You cannot underestimate just how intimidating this would have been. A message was being sent out to the Anglo-Saxons that their world had changed forever. But actually, within just 200 years, all this would start to crumble. So what happened? How could a prosperous, strategic city, now under the watchful eye of its new Norman rulers, just fade away? Well, this deserted hilltop has yet more secrets to reveal from the sky. It would seem that Sarum was home to some citizens even the Norman army couldn't control. This deserted hilltop in Wiltshire was once one of the most important cities in Britain. Sarum was an Iron Age hill fort that became a centre of Saxon power and wealth before William the Conqueror took it as his own, building a magnificent and imposing castle at its heart. But we're now trying to find out why Sarum failed and moved 2 miles to become the modern city of Salisbury. It just doesn't seem to make sense, because in Norman Britain, this place apparently had it all. You have to imagine this place buzzing with life. The domineering castle up there, thousands of Normans blaring away in French and Latin and a few tenacious Saxons. There'd have been butchers and bakers and blacksmiths, and then of course the hallmark of every self-respecting medieval city, a magnificent cathedral. It lies just a few hundred feet from the edge of the castle mound, taking up the whole northwestern quarter of the hilltop. On the ground, a few remnants of wall and a gravel path mark its outline. But from the air, a story of the burgeoning wealth and power of the church begins to reveal itself.
Well, this is more than just a church, it's an entire religious complex. That big square earthwork shape at the bottom of the screen, that's the cloister. And this was a sort of covered walkway where the clergy could walk in deep contemplation, and then you can see hints of other buildings there, just as slight humps and bumps. And in some of these buildings, you'd have had clerics working away. Because the point is, this is more than just a place of worship, it's a place of learning and administration.
That ability to organise and, crucially, write down information became vital when, in the mid-1080s, the Bishop of Sarum and his clerics worked hand in hand with their king on one of the most important documents in our nation's history. Sarum is where they compiled the survey of England's land and resources that became known as the Domesday Book. Most people have heard of the Domesday Book, but I think very few realise that it was plotted and planned and kind of strategised here.
Well, basically, William the Conqueror was getting on, and he suddenly decided, he had this sort of genius to think, well, I've conquered England, what's it actually worth, and where can I get money? And here it was very important because this is the place where he had a bishop who was very much his man, who was surrounded by clerks, very literate people, and they were the people who actually wrote it all up in the 2 famous Domesday books that we still have today.
The Domesday Book was completed in 1086. Sarum and its cathedral thrived under Norman rule as new kings came and went. I mean, so what you're seeing here is this is the moment in the medieval world where men of cloth are really becoming men of means.
That's right. This is when they were really important people, and the bishops were so important here, very much right-hand men to the king, and that's what this shows.
And from the air, the fruits of that success are clear to see.
They really started with a smaller church with those rounded ends. But then they built this much bigger, grander cathedral right on top of it. And that one's almost twice the length of the first cathedral.
The fact that they started again on an even bigger cathedral shows that the influence and resources of the church were on the rise. But there was a problem.
The cathedral is really very close to the castle. There isn't a lot of space for the religious authorities to expand, and they must have been building right up to the edge of the available land. And I can't imagine that going down too well with the soldiering up in the castle there.
The twin forces of church and state were expanding and flexing their muscles in a site that was feeling increasingly restricted. Now, the stones can't tell us how the people felt about that, but we do have an intriguing source in the form of eyewitness accounts from the clergy who lived and worked there. And where better to discover their thoughts than at the magnificent cathedral that is now the pride of Salisbury. In theory, the church and state are supposed to be standing shoulder to shoulder, so why is there an issue up here?
Well, there's very good evidence here from 400 years later, when they were still sort of passing on the memory of how unpleasant it was to live next to the soldiers.
Well, that's really interesting, isn't it? That 400 years later...
400 years.
They still think it's worth kind of recording this affront.
They're still whining about it 400 years later. It's just remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah.
And as you can see here, they went on procession away from Old Sarum down to St Martin's Church down here in what's now Salisbury. And when they went back, they were not let back in. That really upset them, as you might imagine.
The neighbours from up the hill were becoming the neighbours from hell. And all the time, the population was growing. As Ben can see from the air, Sarum was becoming a pressure cooker.
These great defensive ditches and banks were once a great asset, but now they're a real pain, a real hindrance. There's nowhere for the city to expand. You can just imagine houses squeezed in up to the edges of the ditch. And all the time, I guess the castle and the church are hanging on to every square inch of their own land and tussling over it.
Something or someone had to give. And it was the church that decided to take the initiative and deal with the situation. They declared they wanted a new cathedral, away from the castle, on land without any restrictions. So when you want to move a whole cathedral, who do you write to?
Well, to start with, you've got to write to the top. So you've got, in those days, you had to write to the Pope.
And there's his name, isn't it?
Honorius, right up at the top of the page there.
Amazing.
And he sent someone to investigate it, and he's reported that they were correct complaints. It is as inconvenient as he'd been told, and he gives them permission to move the site.
Just great, isn't it? Because we think of this as one of our most historic cities, but Salisbury was the future for them.
Absolutely, it was a completely new town.
Yeah. And just fantastic, we've got the record of that. We've got the actual words telling us why it all happened.
Exactly, it's amazing, isn't it?
And the clergy didn't hang around. Within a year of the Pope agreeing to the move, the foundation stones of this magnificent cathedral were laid. With the potential to expand unfettered, the new city of Salisbury flourished around its new cathedral. Whilst Old Sarum up on the hill began its inevitable decline. Its 2,500 years of history now chronicled in the earthworks and ruins of this beautiful monument. Old Sarum was originally built to defend its occupants against aggression and invasion. But the site just wasn't big enough or even comfortable enough to nourish all that life it was trying to protect. But then the solution, New Sarum, New Salisbury has given a real gift to our nation. One of the most beautiful and historically fascinating cathedral cities in the whole of Britain.